open the session. My name is Kateřina Králová, and I am a professor of contemporary history and memory studies scholar at the Institute of International Studies, Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic, where I also had the Research Center for Memory Studies. Today, I am a convener of this very session entitled Homecoming and Margins, Greek Jews, World War II Memory, and the Politics of Periphery. With us here are today two memory studies scholars, Daniel Levy, professor of sociology at the Stony Brook University, and Jeffrey Olick, William R. Cannon Jr., professor of sociology and history at the University of Virginia, as well as Betsy Anthony, historian and director of Visiting Scholars Program at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and very importantly, author who in her book also touched upon returns and homecoming. The book is called The Compromise of Return, Viennese Jews After the Holocaust, and was published by Wayne State University in 2021. Last but not least, Gonda van Steen, Corrè's Chair of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature at the Department of Classics at King's College London. She is also a director of the Center of Hellenic Studies there at the very same university. Her book is not about the Holocaust survivorship, but on a topic which was very inspiring for me by methodology and by how to work and frame it. And that was Adoption, Memory, Cold War Greece, published in 2019, which introduced the unknown terrain of the adoption stories that became paradigmatical of Cold War politics and children being transferred from Greece to United States, but also to Netherlands, which is sort of the home country of Gonda. It is really my great privilege and unique one as well to discuss and exchange with all the participants on my recent book, and you can see it in the background of the picture, which was deeply influenced by their academic thoughts, approaches, and writing, be it within the Holocaust studies, the Greek studies, or the memory studies. Thank you very much. Sometimes I have not even known you yet, but of course the writing you did and the thoughts and framings you were using in your work were something which navigated me through a very long path of 14 years. And I would suggest a long path in writing books. It's the experience we also all share once we are doing our research and writing our books. So I was thinking maybe just to kick off as we are sitting here, after decades of scholarship, what new insights can the study of the Holocaust and its aftermath still offer? And I would ask the expert on Holocaust studies, that's Betsy. How do you see that?
Thank you, Katerina. Yeah, it's true. Of course, there have now been decades of scholarship and study of the Holocaust. And more recently, in the past 25 years or so, that's broadened to include the aftermath. And those aftermath studies have been really dominated by the displaced persons experiences, although there are works about return, Homecoming being one of them, and Compromise of Return being another. But that, although things came before, that refocus came a little bit in the last 10 years or so. And of course, there were many Jews who returned home after the Holocaust. Not all of them stayed to reestablish their lives and homes, but there are Jewish communities that were rebuilt after the Holocaust, as your work on Greece shows. And of course, in the examples of both yours and my regional focus, that community population was restored to a fraction of what it had been before, but nonetheless restored. And so looking at post-war studies and return in particular, as it's our common focus, and how it contributes to memory studies, the way, as I see it. I see Holocaust survivors' post-war experiences serving as particularly rich case studies for memory studies and for developments in that. And seeing memory as a practice that includes time and space and in particular national political narrative of context, just to name a few elements, but those would be the elements that I would talk about just based on my own experience and expertise. In terms of memory formation over time, by looking at what survivors expected upon their return and what then they actually experienced, how they decided to stay and successfully reroute, how they reintegrated. This all contributes to how Holocaust memory develops over time, not immediately at the point of liberation, but through multiple phases of development, return, and reintegration. Maybe this offers new lenses for viewing how collective memory about the Holocaust and the aftermath forms over time. And in the context of Holocaust studies in particular, tells another part of the story that is not the founding of a new Jewish state or the establishment of a new home in another country altogether. It makes understanding of post-war and aftermath studies more comprehensive and nuanced and fills in more of the bigger picture. As far as a spatial development of memory, that is that we see these survivor returnees encountering, and re-entering familiar yet changed spaces. They return to destroyed communities. They're physical places where memory existed was literally erased. The synagogues are destroyed, neighborhoods are repopulated, and cemeteries are vandalized. And so this spatial aspect of memory is really important. What is the reconstruction of collective memory when the physical anchors are gone, when the physical anchors of that memory are gone? And then the third part that I see as very important in both your study and mine, and any, is the context of this national narrative in the post-war period, into which this context into which these survivors are located or to which they return, and whether they were welcomed or not, whether they could successfully move on or keep evolving or not. This post-war national narrative shapes memories as it determines what becomes publicly acceptable, as well as what remains marginalized. And of course, within that too is the sad reality of memory hierarchy among victims, different victim groups competing for recognition and resources in post-war societies. In Greece's case, the survivors returned during a civil war. Other suffering was immediately apparent to them and to everyone else. And so new insights into how societies construct hierarchies of suffering and how minority memories struggle for space within this dominant national narrative is important too. So I think that time, space, and post-war national context, political context, as shaping experiences, outlook, and memory are also important in aftermath studies, but also placing post-war aftermath studies into memory studies.
Betty, it's so fascinating always when we speak together or when we share our ideas with audience like today, how close actually Austria and Greece can be, and also what I would say connects us, and that connects us also with Gonda's work, is being an outsider and working on those national narratives which are not our national narratives. Gonda, would you like to speak a little bit to that and to what with these aftermath studies, I know you are not in the field of, and I would like to say to the audience that you are not in the field of the Holocaust studies, but what do you see on those post-war national narratives, and what can be offered there in the research we are doing?
Yes, thank you, Katerina. And I want to thank you also for making me a part of this panel. With you, I share the focus on Greece, which we both find very productive, even though we're not Greek. And we come, of course, to a culture where we had to learn the whole archival landscape, but also the political and the historical sensitivities, not to speak of a language that poses its own challenges. I want to take the focus back to Greece then, which is even to today, even until today, very much a territory where history, and especially modern Greek history and Civil War history and public history in general, is very male territory. Dare I say even patriarchal territory. There's a very keen sense of who shapes narratives, where they come from ideologically. So we find ourselves then digging into a territory that is already sensitive left and right, literally and metaphorically, but also being eternal outsiders, being female voices, being coming from other fields that aren't so disciplinarily strict as in Greece, and yet trying to carve out a space for a topic that is very important and underexplored because it has fallen through the cracks of all these topics that were considered more important in the national narrative. And I think your book does a wonderful job of validating the space of your topic and also validating the content that Greece can bring as a periphery, which it will always be, no matter how we twist or turn it, for what is otherwise a very Eurocentric focus and a focus on the bigger countries of Europe, from which Belgium and the Netherlands may drop out just as well. But then using that study as a way to argue for the wider implications of what your topic and your methodology can do. And I like the cover of your book, but this because it is about weaving. It's about interweaving all these difficult strands into a coherent narrative that not only puts all the details meticulously researched for Greece in place, but then kind of takes it on the level of a bigger history, a macro history, moving from the micro to the macro history and leaving a model for what can be a post-conflict study in other geographical areas as well. So I've quite enjoyed seeing that at work in your book, seeing you interweave the very difficult archival work with the very sensitive work with oral testimonies, constantly cross-checking ones against another, constantly also doubting ourselves, let it be said, or being reminded that we should doubt ourselves, let that also be said, and then boldly moving ahead and delivering this fascinating product. All the more kudos to you. It's been very difficult territory to negotiate with people who also draw you into a narrative that exceeds the scholarly, that expects a deeper engagement, a psychological engagement. Again, very difficult territory to navigate. But thank you for doing it.
Thank you for mentioning the cover, and I should say a word about it. I'm very lucky that the Athens-based artist, who is herself second generation of Holocaust survivors, Artemis Alkalai, provided me with that picture, which is really the waving. So this is just a photograph of it. The work is done by hand and is a reminder of the communities lost and rebuilt. But what fascinates me is that, again, as we are doing, Artemis doesn't only connect with the Holocaust and her own history, but she is doing much more about migration, displacement. He was very active and doing wonderful work with the 2015 so-called refugee crisis and so on, and interconnects the meaning of home of then and now in her fascinating conceptual work that she is doing over decades now. So It was a deliberate decision that I, after collecting at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum thousands of photographs from the wonderful photographic archive, once the book was in making, and then I decided against all of them, because I had a feeling that they would represent just some, but never all the survivors and never all those gone. So this work of art for me was a much better expression of those who survived, but also of those who were murdered. And I was thinking that maybe this is also bringing us into the memory studies of category of how we deal collectively, individually, but also universally, because that's something that I think I try to suggest, and Artemis is doing in her work, but also what connects our very specific case studies, such as the one on adoptions that Gonda did, or the one on Jews of Vienna that Betsy did. I don't know, maybe Daniel, would you like to take your turn on thinking about what is still out there and why the aftermath or the survivorship can be productive also from the perspective of memory studies?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I should say I'm not a Holocaust scholar, and what I know about the Greek case is mostly from your book. And I think the separation between Holocaust studies and Holocaust memory actually matters here. I would say that your book is not a memory studies book, but is a book that provides a lot of insight and stimulation for memory studies. First of all, congratulations. It's the first book I see where Halbwachs is not in the reference list totemically, which is a refreshing thing. Having said that, I do think, especially considering the temporal dimension, for instance, the work of Assmann, the distinction between cultural memory and communicative memory, strikes me as extremely important for your work, especially given that you interview people. And I could be provocative and say that these are not their personal memories. We can talk about that. These are memories that are embedded in a cultural discourse already. That's not what Assmann means by cultural memory, but they are in and of themselves already embedded in a community of returnees. So, and I'm obviously they have different experiences, but I think that is one part to look at. The other thing is Holocaust memory is kind of important coming out of here because it also meshes and it talks with other kind of, how shall I say, I'm not sure how to put that. It speaks to other issues. I mean, for instance, the question that you raise about homecoming, and here you connect it to what I think is longing to a community. That is, and I'm sure Betsy has a different sense of the returnees, is one modality, but there were other modalities, right? So it's very interesting. I think your case is super interesting because I don't know of any case where 95% of survivors returned to their home, and I don't know if that matches the Viennese story, certainly not the German story. So that is to say, motivations to return can be material. In the case of the GDR and convinced communists, it was ideological. So I like the fact that we can kind of juxtapose these things, which I think makes a lot of sense to, how should I say, to heighten the comparative angle, and that, which I find to be very generative.
Maybe just for those among the audience who are not well versed with the Holocaust history in Greece, it's important to say that many of the survivors came initially back home, but the many of the survivors means very little in percentage. So if Greece had nearly 80,000 Jews before the war, those coming back were not more than 10,000. And that's important so that it doesn't sound like in fact, the percentage of the Jews of Germany who survived was much higher than the percentage of the Jews of Greece who survived, right? So seeing that the imminent danger in Germany is being perceived with the logic of leaving Germany as early as possible before the war even started, or before the Holocaust was put on the table in the way of destruction, complete destruction of the communities. People manage to go out, whereas in Greece we have those people who somehow are thinking, do have the feeling and the perspective of this is happening in Central Europe, it cannot come to our country. So this should be said also in the context that the destruction was huge and was in percentage one of the worst in Europe, in fact. But it is true that going back to Greece, and for many reasons, be it for those internally displaced or externally displaced, meaning forcefully displaced either to camps or forcefully taking the way of emigration out of Greece, that many of them were taking the advantage to return, or were pushed by the winners to return. And that is speaking about European politics, which again, in today's perspective, sometimes is half forgotten, that everybody who was displaced was sort of categorized based on the nationality, which they lost long before, because they were mostly without any nationality as Jews. And then after the war, they were virtually and physically pushed back to the country of origin, in this case, meaning Greece. And this, in my research, feels like a very forgotten story, as well as the one which, again, somehow connects us with what we see in migration studies and forced migration, which can happen because of hot conflicts, but also because of environmental crisis and other crises. We do see not many neighboring countries being of much help. And this is another layer of, why didn't they go to the neutral countries nearby if the Jews in those countries were not destroyed? And even some of the countries, such as in case of Bulgaria, claiming that they are the country which is sort of righteous among the nations, meaning saving its own Jews. It was definitely not a safe harbor for the Jews of the neighboring countries, and they couldn't go there first and couldn't be safe there as well. So, I mean, all those entanglements, how we understand the past stories in our cultural background today, and in how we teach history, and how we still have very much event-oriented history and less process-oriented history, is something which, in my opinion, brings us very close, and memory studies can help in understanding it. Jeff, how do you feel about that?
So first, let me just say thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's far beyond my normal expertise, and I quite honestly probably wouldn't have read the book without the stimulus, but I'm really glad I did. So also want to say congratulations. I know this has been a long road, and it's quite an event that the book has appeared. It's actually, to those of you who haven't had the chance to see it, it's quite a remarkable book, particularly in the way that it weaves together these important stories, these experiences, without losing either nuance of differences across the materials or the eye to general theory. It captures what's personal to you. It captures the unique experiences of what as a sociologist we would call respondents, but since it's long ago, they're not responding in any way. It gets at meticulous use of historical and sociological materials, and then it brings it into contact with theory. And so really that's quite a remarkable achievement, incredibly hard to do. Let me focus on the question with which we started, which is what new insights after decades of research can study of Holocaust and its aftermath still offer? And this sounds like a relatively straightforward question, but actually when you scratch the surface, it's actually a really deep and complicated and layered question. So one of the ways I would go about answering it is to highlight, I mean, it's a question about temporality in a way. We've been doing this kind of, or people have been doing this kind of work for a long time about something that happened relatively long time ago. And what's always amazing is how quickly things change. So, in reading the last few pages of your book, for instance, it absolutely, you can see that already you wrote it just a few years ago, and already just in the last year, 1, 2, 3, 4 years, the entire landscape of memory politics seems to have changed yet again. So I would highlight when we're talking about work on Holocaust memory or the Holocaust itself, which again, like Daniel, is not my area of expertise, we should keep in mind the three moving temporalities that we're dealing with here. The temporality of the events we're discussing or studying, which is, it's there on the title, on the front page of the cover of your book, 1941 to 1946, a particular historical period, which of course unfolds over time. The second temporality we should point out is the time period in which the author is doing this kind of research. How much remove is there, but also a temporality within that work, as you keep referring to 14 years, which is a long time and a short time simultaneously. But then, of course, there's the temporality of the reading and the reception of the book, which takes place after your 14 years are done, and then the dialogues that go on. So the question itself raises the issue of the way in which all the work that we're doing, all of us together in some way, we're doing in time and about time and with time and over time. And so it's a constantly moving target. And so when you ask the question about what's left for Holocaust studies, or why do we need another book about some neglected aspect of moving to the next question, a peripheral place, the question is always, why now, except the now is always changing. And in that, I think the answer is contained, is that we're doing this work, we're writing, we're researching, and we're reading, and we're studying lives that all are changing over time. So what does this look like now? What will it look like in 2 years when someone sits down to read the book, or in 10 years when a graduate student is thinking of working on some aspect of the Greek Holocaust and goes to this important book? And then is reading it within a different kind of context. So it seems to me that the process of reading and writing about the Holocaust and its details, it matters where we are in this temporal sequence, and that's always changing. And so to me, the question about what's new that's left to be said, what's new is the context in which we're writing and reading. And that's incredibly important. And so this is a dialogue that takes place through time. So we have to keep at it. It's just like whenever we, if we're teaching, for instance, and you read a book or prepare something the first time you teach it, and then you've been teaching the same course for 10 years or 30 years, as in my case, you read that, or when you're writing a new paper, you read something that you haven't read for 5 or 10 or 15 years again, and you see it in a completely new light. So that is a very complicated answer to this question of what's new to say. There's always something new to say because the position from which we're saying it is always new.
Thank you so much for that. And this is also the question my students are sometimes asking, can I write about the Holocaust if everything was written? And the answer is, of course, yes, you have to write about it because your positionality and the time around you is so different to whatever was written before you started to ask your own questions. And if we open any topic with that logic, it always makes sense to go back to topics which may have the Bibles of research, so to say, written decades ago. And I think it's a very important message, especially to students who are thinking, oh, I should have something completely new and cover a niche which was never covered before. Sometimes it can be more productive to go to the research which has been done and ask new questions and open it up from a different angle. So I cannot agree with you more. And this sort of brings us very nicely to the second big part, which while we were discussing until now mostly temporalities, the next step I would like to make with you together is going to the liminalities, to the spaces and places. And those of us in the Holocaust research would know, and I recently heard in a radio session, because we have the 80 years of the end of the World War II, that Germany, France, and Poland were the most research and most important, so to say, countries in the topic, both of the World War II history of Europe, but also in the Holocaust studies. Now, I know it's not all of us in Holocaust studies, but I think it's all of us who sort of try to make sense what is in the center, and not only territorially in the center, but also in center of those researches being done, and what remains on the edges, what is on the periphery, and what the peripheries can bring us. How would you see that, Gonda, from the perspective of Greece, which you were also researching as a territory? The struggle of Europe, which ended up sort of, in my understanding and in my reading of contemporary Greek history, on a periphery.
Well, as I already said, I think the periphery of Greece towards what is Western Europe has only, if anything, more to offer to broaden and nuance our understanding. And you did that very well, both bringing out the uniqueness of Greece, but also arguing for the wider ramifications. But I think there is something else going on that brings us back to geography, detours of return, the logistics of return, the very thinly stretched resources with which aid workers, for instance, could assist people on their return. I think your book does very well making that periphery physical. If we see what convoluted trajectories some people have taken to finally reach Greece again, then you just realize just how hard it still was to reach a country at the periphery of Europe, where also all infrastructure had been thoroughly destroyed and was about to descend into an era of more destruction during the Civil War. So periphery becomes very literal when you see that all of Europe and all these various displaced person camps and aid workers constantly have to juggle the logistics of aid and very thinly stretched resources, in which Greece does not rise to the top as a priority and never will. And so I think you periphery then becomes, in a way, part of the post-conflict conflict. It's not just the aftermath of conflict, it is still a conflict. Maybe not as daunting as the previous conflict, but as much as you call it a post-conflict study, it is still conflict upon conflict, in which the meaning of periphery becomes blatantly clear. I was struck by a detail that you mentioned in the beginning of the book, that already in February of 1946, the Jewish committees themselves declared the number of returnees established and kind of want to close that chapter. That's very early, given that until May of 1945, some territories of Greece still had German troops, even though the actual liberation of Greece again in Athens and Thessaloniki had happened in October 44. There is no such thing, you say very eloquently, as one liberation, one date, not even one liberator. So the fact that you work on a periphery and then a very dispersed periphery with islands and mountains and adjacent territories that are either friendly or hostile, and the Dodecanese under Italian control, and all of these various interweavings that make the periphery so unique and yet so rich, all of that, I think, make us stand still and then somewhat wonder why they would choose a date as early as February 46 to call it good on the returnees, to call the number established, when people took months and months to return. And so as periphery, then you've both made it literal and metaphorical in very productive ways. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And with what you were saying, you also touched upon that there is nothing like one periphery of something. So it's not only about Greece being at that days at the periphery of Europe, but Greece itself having so many peripheries in the internal sense. So even
Exactly.
coming to a city means not only crossing borders of many countries, but it may mean crossing rivers and mountains and political issues, of course, of one single country within. And this brings me to the idea, while I was researching the full scale of Greece and the communities which were not only in the big cities, Betsy was doing research on very established metropolis of Europe. Vienna was also the place where both Jews and non-Jews of Greece went to study because the universities were not yet established in Greece. So for most of Europe, Vienna back then was the very center. But somehow when I read your book, I still feel that throughout what happened during the war and then the very entangled liberation of Austria, still Vienna was sort of on the periphery, right? How do you feel about the positioning Vienna and maybe comparing it what you read about Greece?
It's interesting. I was, as I was listening to you talk, I was feeling the commonalities, but I had never actually thought of Vienna as periphery. I think that the post-war narrative of Vienna as victim was successful for a number of decades, and you know, in a sense, Austrian politicians and Austrians were able to sort of extricate the history from the German part of the history and to turn it around, that the Germans did this and the Austrians were, you know, occupied by military force and dragged into a war they never wanted. And so in a way, I think as far as it appearing or feeling like on the periphery of Holocaust studies, at least for a time, it may have to do with that, the sort of effective sort of dislocation of the history from the actuality of Austria being a part of Germany and taking full part as a perpetrator country. This just is flowing out of my mouth right now because you were saying such interesting things that sparked that. But for sure, I would think about it more thoroughly if I were to actually say Austria was on the periphery. I think I could make a good argument, though. I see what you're saying, and I think that it is interesting because, as you said, whenever we sit together, we find all of these similarities between these two countries that had very different wartime experiences and histories.
well, as we are writing historical work mostly and being historians by discipline, even if borrowing from many other fields, how would a sociologist react on that? What about the liminalities in terms of your perspective, Daniel? How would you see that? Is there something like a periphery you see in that? And
Yeah, I think there's a periphery, but I'd like to shift the attention to a, let's call it historiographical periphery, not so much geographic. Of course, the geographic arguments are very important, and also to a conceptual one. First of all, in general terms, I think it's interesting to note when the Holocaust memory and commemorative efforts take place. Periphery and center are pretty much aligned. The periphery a little later, but comes together here. In the case of Greece, I think the Waldheim affair, which is, I think, is central in terms of the public awareness of it, clearly also for the Austrians, who indeed, as Betsy pointed out, came very, very late, and some say not even yet, to a reckoning with their role in the Holocaust. But the bigger issue is what counts as Holocaust. And here I think Greece, like other peripheral places, have become subject to neglect because they don't match Auschwitz and the industrial killing machine. And here I'm, of course, talking about Timothy Snyder's historiographic intervention. It just didn't fit because it was a different story, and that is one reason. The other reason, I think, is that Greece complicates the narrative. I'm not saying that there was anybody deliberate doing this or not. It destroys the narrative because it's the Holocaust is seen as a primarily Ashkenazi experience, and in Greece you have this mix, and the Sephardic Jews somehow don't fit. And here I want to echo what Jeff said before. It's not a coincidence then also because we are talking about the fact that Jews actually did very well under the Ottoman Empire. And that is also something that does not align itself with current discourse, because what? Muslims and Jews? How can that be? And so on and so forth. I'm being a little bit polemical, but I'm doing that in order to remind ourselves of what Jeff said, namely that the context, the temporality during which we analyze, during which people speak, matters a great deal. Lastly, do I have a last point here? No, I want to say one thing that is very important that is neglected in other things. That's the role of religion, or more importantly, national churches, which is essentially the key turning point for you to ensure that others are excluded. And that's not just in Greece, that's obviously also a story in Poland. I'm not saying it's Christianity versus Judaism, but it's particular types of churches that are very much involved in nation-state building and are national churches. So I think that I wanted to say that actually earlier is a real important, shall I say, another kind of blind spot in a lot of historiography. But I think the kind of things that there's a certain topoi that you expect to be part of what is the Holocaust, and Greece in many ways doesn't fit that. But of course, a historian, that's also an answer to why we need to study more.
Jeff, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So I guess just to be a little silly about it, periphery is in the eye of the beholder, and is constant. Again, the same theme again is constantly changing. I was also just thinking about, you know, in when we're talking about a place like Thessaloniki, it seems very far for us from European cultural centers, but of course that depends on what point in history we're talking about. But wasn't obviously peripheral for the people who wanted to return there. But I was also thinking about the ways in which this whole notion of center and periphery not only changes over time, but what meanings we ascribe to it. So if we were looking at a slightly later period, if we were going to the period of the Greek Civil War, and struggles through the 60s and 70s, for instance, and you think about something that's on the edge of a larger region, if we're talking about the West, for instance, or Christendom, and you think about it as a tectonic plate, it's actually at the periphery where all the action happens. If you think about an earthquake, it's where two plates rub up against each other, and that's like Greece. Greece is a periphery in this regard, but it's also an epicenter if we're talking about the two tectonic plates rubbing up against each other, which is something that we see in the decades after the period that you look at. The question basically is, why are peripheries overlooked and what difference does it make? And the question, I think, answers itself insofar as when you define something as a periphery, that means we're going to overlook it. But what we need to do, and what I think your book does, is it recenters the periphery. So it challenges that discourse. And what's important about works like yours, that reminds us that the world is substantially more diverse and more complex than the grand narrative tells us. The other part of the equation is that we have to remember the ways in which the center itself is constituted by the imagination of the periphery. If you go back to the 19th century, you look at the way the ancient world, or ancient Greece, is part of defining what civilization is. Then you looked at the lived reality, the notion of relative levels of development, or what Daniel said about the centers of industrial killing, or the way in which we define the Holocaust in terms of the gas chamber rather than in terms of other forms of violence. Leads us to question. So I find the whole notion of center and periphery, while interesting to look at the ways in which these concepts are culturally constructed and historically constructed, remembering that they're constantly changing, but also remembering that in some ways we need to be very specific about what the actual historical or political or social content of peripheralness versus centrality actually consists.
Thank
I
you
want
for that.
Can I piggyback
Yeah,
that just
Daniel.
because you think, for instance, let's say Estonia, clearly, sorry, peripheral, but studied. We know about collaboration. I had to read your book to learn about collaboration. You know, I had to, I always thought only about Thessaloniki, and so on and so forth. So all of these things come out because it doesn't fit the mold, but it's clearly what, as Jeff said, what makes it peripheral. Basically, nothing.
Thank you for your thoughts. I think it's actually going where I intended. Thank you for that. And this is also what I try to tackle in the book, and that's the uniqueness and universality of those stories. And I was thinking maybe Gonda, you could join me on that sort of thinking. That for me, reading Greek historiography and following the national narrative of Greece, it still plays with the uniqueness of the Greek history, whereas as we hear from you, Daniel and Jeff, there is so little knowledge on that, which pushes the knowledge about modern Greece on a sort of epistemological periphery, right? So how did you encounter that, Gonda, these uniqueness and feeling that we are still within the national narratives in the center or even epicenter of all histories, and on the other hand, the universality of the stories we are telling, right?
Right. There is such a thing as Greek exceptionalism. I'll be the first to agree. And yes, we find ourselves with embracing a topic that is on the periphery of what fits the national narrative, which is very much pressured into a particular framework time. And again, and the Civil War is one of these folky that really brings out the intensity with which the Greeks wish to craft a national narrative. And given that the Jewish returns, for those who could return, comes right before the outbreak of the Civil War, their memory is also immediately absorbed by it. And so the challenge that you bring out so beautifully in your book is how to survive survival. Surviving survival. So I think in the end, though, the solution is to work with integrity, with meticulous research, and to stick to your guns. Sorry for the military metaphor, but really do what it is that you feel you need to be doing to finally start deconstructing the Greek exceptionalist narrative with other narratives that need to be heard. What I'm constantly reminded of reading your book is that I could just see these people return and say, "Oh my God, you're the lucky one," which is also the story that my adoptees, the children moved from Greece to the US for adoption, were constantly told, "You are so lucky. You have no idea what would have happened to you if you had stayed. You're so much better off." The fact that you're not even I'm not going to use the word victim, but as a survivor, that you're not even credited with your own memory, that you're already called lucky when your life is based on a history of loss, that your own memory is instantly disavowed and silenced by people who supposedly know better, even though have no idea or no direct experience. That too is a little bit the kind of task we've taken on with this kind of research topic, and bringing a revisionist narrative to a very exceptionalist and very occasionally very authoritarian narrative about Greek history. But here we are, and we carry on.
Thank you, Gunda. It was beautifully expressed. And what also sort of connects us is that we are not really going into trauma studies. We are only trying as effectively as we can and to show the realities, how they are narrated a long time after, and how they are preserved through archives and archival sources, and how they unite and differ with the stories remembered or told or written, and then reworked again in public discourses and also in historical work. What would you say that is the most effective approach, or what are the most effective sources for developing this more nuanced understanding of the aftermath of World War II? Betsy, very similar things again we have been working on.
Yeah, and similarly, I think we both really recognize and prioritize the survivor voice and what's gained through testimony. And of course, that also implies the historian's obligation to treat that responsibly. And so I would say an approach of utilizing survivor testimony with the archival documentation, with especially local archival documentation, to the survivor voice tells us things that we can't know from official documentation, and the official documentation can anchor up details of the survivor's story in order for us to then gain the personal and the subjective that they have to share in their testimonies, the emotional, the psychological, the interpersonal dimensions that aren't captured in official records. I think specific to the post-war, too, the post-war period, testimonies tell us, specifics about looking for relatives and how does one do a search like that. We know we have the Erlson archive records to see the documentation of searches that were conducted, but how do they find out where to go, and how do they submit a request, and how do they how do they actually, there are a few precious stories of people being reunited, and how else do we know that unless we pay attention to and prioritize the survivor testimony. So I think that it's the survivor testimony grounded in the archival documentation to anchor the details of a story, and to contextualize and verify. I have other examples I can think of, but I don't want to take up all the time. I just think that I appreciate your prioritization and value of survivor voice as I do myself. And throughout your book, it's clear that you worked so hard to put them forward, and that I think is a really important approach for Holocaust studies.
Thank you. Conceptually, for me, it was a real struggle to make a decision how to call those voices. And I decided against testimonies because I found the term so loaded and so much law and retribution related that I didn't want to say all those voices are just to justify themselves. There are much more voices of desperate, but also voices of survivorship, of making it through all those difficult times, and again, even accounts that's again too economic. So how to call those stories and how to frame them and what to do with them in a work like that, where you have to call them a name. That was a big part of struggle, I have to say. And I think it's methodologically and conceptually also a very refreshing and useful struggle that we have been going through. How to call the voice, the written voice, both the written voice, the interview, or somebody recording and writing on his own, her own. That was a challenge, but a very refreshing challenge as well. How do you see, Jeff, all that struggle around the approaches and sources being used in historical writing in general, and in that case in particular?
Well, so this brings us back, it seems to me, to the first question about what's left to do and what's new in Holocaust studies. It seems to me the question does shift now to generational change and transmission over time. You refer in the book to Jan and Aleida Ostman's distinction between communicative memory and cultural memory, which I think is I've always thought that distinction is vastly overdrawn. I mean, but they do deal with it with this notion of the floating gap in between when communicative memory is becoming cultural memory. And it seems to me that's the really interesting process to be studying now at this particular point in time. The grandparents, the survivors themselves are gone. The question is how these stories, how these experiences, how these references shape people's perceptions today, the grandchildren. Even back to my first point about temporality, in your own writing, for instance, your relationship with your grandmother comes through as crucially important to framing the questions that you want to ask. The question, I don't want to push you too hard into the future too quickly, but the question is, how will you see it when you're the grandmother talking about these issues with your grandchildren, and on and on from that. So to me, the most interesting questions at this point are these questions of what's happening in the floating, the dynamics of the floating in the floating gap, how these processes of enculturation, if you will, to use the cultural memory versus communicative memory concepts imply. And that, of course, entails different kinds of methods. Direct face-to-face conversations, setting up focus groups, observing or stimulating conversations between or within families, between grandparents and grandchildren, both groups of the same age cohort, but also different perspectives between different age cohorts. So actually the problem moves, it seems to me, from the realm of history and historical research methods to the realm of self-serving, but to the realm of sociology and sociological research methods, where we're dealing with living subjects. So I mean, but there's no limit on the number of different things and different methodologies, and I'm a methodological pluralist, and so come one, come all to this kind of methodological question.
I want to piggyback on that. I think, first of all, I think it's probably fair to say that you're doing oral history, and I think in your field that's been a long way coming, and probably still in some places not looked at as real history. I'm not saying that. I'm a sociologist, we do ethnography, so I completely understand. So that's, I think, maybe part of the motivation to ask that. In general, I would say compare. And I'm thinking here, for instance, about the post-imperial significance of these things, right? Because German Jews was one thing. I don't know if there's such a thing as Austrian Jews, Betsy. They were all kind of imperial Jews. I don't want to say all of them were Josef Roth, but many of them were. And if in Germany you had the distinction that those are Ostjuden, in Austria, they were all from Galicia, or many of them. So it wasn't quite clear. So it's I'm exaggerating for the purpose of illustration. So it's kind of a thing. And so that, and the second thing is, and I have to say, I'm very sympathetic to history. Some of my best friends are historians. And I'm saying that because Jan Assmann has another concept which I think is particularly valuable for people to do oral history, and that's memo history, right? So this is not about the factuality, but about the actuality. You interview the people you interview in 19 or in 2010 or 15 or whenever, and these are old people, and they have accumulated a lot of things. And by that, I'm not saying what they're saying is not accurate, but there has been a long time and many, many memory tropes. And even if they're not academics, they have been privy, they have seen Schindler's List, and so on and so forth. They are embedded in that. So therefore, I'm not saying you have to do only memory history, but I think it can be a helpful tool for historians who do oral history.
Thank you very much. I see we are coming to the end of our wonderful conversation. We have just the 5 of us here. And if there is nobody who wishes to add to this last bulk we prepared for you, then I would open the floor to the questions coming from the audience. So I would like to ask our assistant from the dMSA if we could enable all the tools that people can switch on the microphones, turn on the microphones and cameras if they wish to, and they can join us, be it through the icon of Q&A or be it directly with us on camera and on screen. I guess this will all need a moment for you. I see already a first hand of Andrew Apostolou, who is with us. Andrew, it's great to have you here. Please turn on your microphone and be with us.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, congratulations on the book, which I'm looking forward to discussing in more detail later this year. So just first thing, it'd be interesting to hear you speak more about one of the reasons why Greek history and indeed Greek Jewish history is marginalized, which is that the denial of archival access and the destruction of archival documents. It'd be interesting to hear more about that from you. I'd also like to hear a bit more, if you could, about memories of the survivors about Salonika, because as you know, Athens in Jewish historical terms is a null place. There's nothing interesting happens there. Salonika is a center of Torah learning. It is a center of Judeo-Espanol culture. The Judeo-Espanyols completely dominated the Sephardic chief rabbinate for hundreds of years. And then after 1945, Jewish life switches to Athens. So how do the survivors kind of deal with that when they move to a city that they may feel safer in, as opposed to Salonika, a city of collaboration, but a city that just doesn't have that Jewish value in terms of religious and cultural. And then just a quick comment. I think Professor Van Steen used the word sensitive, and I think that was a really good choice. I think it's worth remembering that the public memory of the Holocaust in Greece is actually insensitive, because it's about the state telling us that the primary culprits for the massive murder of Greek Jews are the Jews themselves, in particular the chief rabbi of Salonika, and there is precisely zero acknowledgement that there should be any reflection. I mean, the former mayor of Salonika was an exception in terms of collaboration and looting of Jewish property. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And Andrew is another colleague historian who we have been discussing with many topics and very often. What I see very interesting in what you asked about, Andrew, and that's the Salonika or the Saloniki-Athens conflict, because as I argue after the war and even during the war, I feel Salonika disappeared. There is nothing like Salonika anymore, and linguistically disappeared, but through the many languages which disappeared from the Saloniki, and Judeo-Spanish, but also French and Turkish and Slavic speakers and everything what was the first part of the 20th century. But I also do see that the story of the Saloniki is something which is being silenced not only on the state level, but also, and there we are coming into the trauma things, that it is very painful for the survivors to think about the city as it was before the war, because it disappeared for them in any sense they could imagine. So the hopes and expectations with which they are coming back, be it internally displaced or externally displaced, I see as being completely broken and false once they are in the city. So maybe it's easier for them to be in the capital, and of course being in the capital in that sense, and Salonika was not a long part of Greece, and again we are going in the imperial and post-imperial tradition. So how much in those days of the beginning of the war do we actually speak about completely established Greek city in terms of Thessaloniki or Salonika? It's still in transition sort of from the metropolis in the Aegean, which was more close to free harbor in some terms than to a second city of a nation state as it became part of Greece. But I think it's also instrumental to see other parts of Greece, such as Corfu, which is not Sephardic, but has the tradition of yeshivas and of educating Jewish religious elites within the other sea or other part of the Mediterranean for a long time, or taking a closer look on road, and while putting them together and comparing or suggesting the trajectories of each of those communities, I think we maybe better understand, I hope we better understand the position of the survivors of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki, and why Greek history is marginalized. Maybe this should be also in a conversation we could have with Gonda together on that matter. So if you can help me out here, that I don't lose my voice now.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think you raised some very important points. Katerina's book does actually touch quite beautifully and very sensitively, if I may use that word again, on the history of the rabbi in Thessaloniki, on the accusations and suspicions of neighbors and business partners stealing properties, on the facts of that, on the disappointment to have to return to that. And so it is, she draws quite a nuanced picture of all of that. And I also wanted to bring another book in the mix that is also recent, Tony Mulhall's recent childhood story from when he was a little boy and his mother took him out of Thessaloniki to go and find anonymity and refuge in Athens, and also how that was a story of coming back to lost property, and how you can see his level of coping with that, but then also his mother's inability to cope with that. So I think this is definitely a story that Katerina has started with a very nuanced look, and clearly there is more work being done that goes in that direction, because the picture is of course so different also all over Greece. Katerina was mentioning Corfu, Zakynthos is a different story, Rhodes, Athens, Thessaloniki. You're dealing with Nisides, with little islands within a periphery already. Yeah.
I would say this is historically so different to what I know from a compact little country like Czechia is, where those cities, towns, and even villages are better connected with each other. And if we see the Jewish population, it's not just cities and not with such a great distance as there is in Greece. And this is fascinating. So even though I'm speaking about and covering all of Greece, in fact, the compactness is much lower than in Czechia with about the same population back then, or Czechoslovakia with the same population back then, and the exchange going on between the communities and towns and cities, which again makes it very different, because if you would have only the statistics and the numbers, it could be slightly similar to Greece, and yet it's so different. And why the history of Greece is not being dealt with that extensively, and the problem of archives, I agree absolutely, especially for a researcher from outside of Greece. It is a big challenge, because I cannot go easily to the archives and easily cover my work within days or weeks. If I go to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, I can download a lot of stuff. I can continue my research at home, and in many other archives and institutions as well. This is not exactly the case of Greece. But then yet again, the history can be covered from all archives elsewhere. And even though I would say contemporary history was neglected in the whole national narrative, and not being considered a real history. And there is, in my view of an outsider dealing with Greece, the core of the problem, that for a long time in the national discourse and national narrative, the 20th century was not exactly placed as a historical century, and was still a very fresh part of politics, which is better not to mix up with, and better not to cover yet. And of course, the rich and long Greek history doesn't help. So it's always overlayered, and especially in the public discourse and in educational sources, overlayered by the long and rich history of antiquity, Byzantium, and the cherishing periods, which can very much help nation building in a sense, but then again make a damage to how we understand what we lived through recently, and what is also part of our family history, which needs to be covered. We see it a little bit in Czech Republic with covering the communism and the end of the communism, in that sense that it's still a very sensitive topic, very hard to be, let's say, dealt with at schools, etc., etc. But in Greece, in my understanding, this for a long time was a case of nearly the whole entangled and very complicated and complex 20th century. So that would be maybe my answer to, the problems, the structural problems we have, yes, but on the other hand, they can be overcome, sort of. But to overcome the official narrative is, in my opinion, much harder.
Yeah. I also wanted to add that ever since 2018, the situation has actually become even more difficult to gain access to sources in which names are mentioned, because everybody waves in front of you the GDPR, the data protection law, without actually understanding the data protection law. But it is an easy excuse to say, we can't give you access because there are all sorts of names here. We don't know if these people are still alive or not. And that becomes some sort of a cover to give you no access at all. So the easiest access about Greek sources is actually obtained outside of Greece.
I agree. I see that we have some questions in chat. Let me open the chat and see it. It is rolling, so I don't see anything yet. And I don't see a hand at the moment.
It's in Q&A, not in chat.
Yeah, in Q&A, but somehow it doesn't want to upload here. So if anybody of you can read it, yeah,
Lisa
please.
Peschel asks, Katarina, you spoke about specifically not drawing on trauma studies. That has been such a dominant paradigm in Holocaust studies for so many years. Do you, think a shift away from it is now taking place?
Thank you for asking, Lisa, and it's great to have you with us. And my feeling is that trauma as such, as a terminology, as a term, is very much loaded. And maybe this goes also with what Jeff was saying, or he brought me on that idea, that it's also about where we stand right now. As I said, I'm the third generation, and I don't feel the same impact as my mother would feel or my grandmother would feel, of course. And second, I see trauma being used on regular basis and maybe overused, but definitely framed in a different way in connection with psychologies of youth and everything what was happening through COVID. And sometimes I think that speaking about a trauma is very different than we used to do, or when I started my research, where I used to read about it in context of a major damage, be it incarceration, gas chambers, the Holocaust, experience of camps, experience of massive loss of everybody in the family, of oppression, of being singled out and being sort of imprisoned when hiding, and so on and so on. So for me, trauma is getting a new meaning, is being shifting in the theory, and I do not see it as useful or as fruitful anymore, as may have been the case 10 or 15 years ago. So that is something which also brought me on a different path. And I do not want to speak about victims. I really decided very consciously to go through the survivorship and through the story of the survivorship more than through the feelings of victims and victimized people. And that maybe, would I do a different research? Would I ask myself different research questions? I think still trauma studies could be very relevant in what I was doing. And in the time I was doing that, I didn't see it as central as maybe I would have had earlier on in my life. I don't know if anybody wants to react on the trauma studies issue and memory studies connected together as well. Daniel, I see your microphone is now on.
I was about to read. I was about to read you the next thing. I don't have much to say about it other than I think the connection with trauma is definitely geared towards victimhood. And since you wanted to give these people agency and not by definition put them there, it doesn't pop up. I think trauma is related to questions of social justice, which I don't think play as importantly because you really want to get a sense of these returnees. So I personally don't see how it would fit, and I agree it's overused and it is not necessary, but it's obviously also a symptom of our times and what quote unquote memory studies is associated with and so on and so on. So that's important in that respect, but not in the sense of the actual work you do, I think. If you want, I can read you the question. The next thing is, my name is Dr. Sima Velkovic from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you very much for this inspiring conversation. I'm wondering, do you see the changing of narrative in Greek survivors' testimonies with a change of the politics of memory?
Thank you very much for that question and for being with us here during our conversation. It is a very interesting question, and you were asking about Greek survivors' testimonies. In my book, I again very consciously decided not to call the Jews Greek Jews, but Jews of Greece. And this is not only because of their very diverse background before the war and how they were considered Greeks or not considered Greeks during their persecution, which is complicated in any country of Europe, of course, stripping Jews of the citizenship or making them second-class citizens. But in the case of Greece, as I explained in my book, the question of the citizenship and belonging, it goes even deeper down because the Greek Orthodox Church is taking the only role of the true Greeks in that sense. So it's very hard to speak about Greek Jews if they are not really, even by law, acknowledged as fully Greek, right? But what triggered my attention when asking about Greek survivors' testimonies, I first started to work exclusively with testimonies in Greek. And then I shifted, the next layer was the other languages, mainly English, but also some French, Bulgarian, and Spanish. My Hebrew is unfortunately non-existent, so I called on some friends who were helping me out, at least with some testimonies, which I identified based on the keywords as crucial to understand. And thanks to all the translators, I was still working without artificial intelligence. It became very much with us only after the book manuscript was submitted. So I couldn't use the new tools of dealing with voice recognition and with both text and voices. So I really had to have real people to help me out with voice, and used only translators on to get a general picture of some written recollections and life stories. And in that sense, I saw a major difference in how the survivorship is being told. Whereas in interviews in Greek, there was a very dominant moment in each and every interview of the Greek solidarity with Jews. Once I went into the interviews recorded outside of Greece, there was much clear notion about anti-Semitism, about collaborators, and about local non-Jews not being nice to Jews. So what I could feel was the loyalties being expressed, verbalized, or silenced in very different ways regarding of to whom, in which community was the one or the other survivor speaking. And unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of those interviews were recorded in about the same time period of about 10 to 15 years, which was sort of compact. And in case of Greece, it was the post-Cold War period mostly, whereas in the United States, there are some recordings even from the end of the Cold War, for example. But in the Greek context, the recording is coming only in the 90s, really. And the loyalties are persistent throughout the period of all those interviews, throughout all those 10 or more years, where the majority of the interviews is being collected. I hope it answered a bit the question you were asking, even if indirectly. Thank you for this.
I don't see any more questions in the Q&A section.
I see Jay Prosser's hand, and he is with us on the screen. I think, Jay, you can ask straight away. Thank you.
I wondered about the reception of Homecoming in Greece and what that's been and how important that is to you.
Could you maybe elaborate in which way the Homecoming?
Your book. So what the reception of it has been in Greece. And I guess sort of the question in there is who's taken it up, if anybody, who you imagined you were writing for, who this book most speaks to. But I'm particularly interested in the reception because it's been out a while now. And I'm wondering how much it's changing the scene.
This is a very interesting question, and I have to say the reception in Greece by yet is not something I really saw or perceived per se. I had a presentation in Athens on that book, and I would say that many online presentations were more visited than the one taking place in Athens. It was also very interesting to have a debate about the book being translated into Greek, which is a very dragging and complicated question. But I published already 2 books in Greek, so I was not a newcomer on the Greek market, and yet there was a certain hesitance explained by the problems of the Greek book market and by the general economic crisis. Hopefully we will have more voices to see if this is the core of the problem. I wrote the book of course, for people who would like to know more about Greece, who would like to know more about communities. But in general, for me, that was a path which was to speak about homecoming, about end of the war not being a single moment, about homecoming, which is not happening only after things settle down, be it with the V-Day or with a peace treaty or with anything else, but a way of longing which takes a decision, in my opinion, much earlier than the actual moment or the actual trajectory of return, and which in a way can be destroyed even or rebuilt in a very different way even after the process is on the first side completed. So the homecoming actually can take much longer than, you know, getting back your flat or being back in your city. But the longing for the homecoming, that's also important for me to see it as such. And in that way, I very much hope that this book can be food for thought, not only within the Holocaust studies, but also in general in migration studies and in studies of historical migration as such and displacement. Eager to see where it will end up and what reactions I will get. We all know that academic reviews take some time until they are published, and we have to see what will be coming, or I have to see what will be coming in the future. But I generally didn't want to write a book just for the community. I wanted to be very clear about the gratitude and about how important it is that all those voices and all those people who shared with me are there, and how much I treasure them and treasure them, but not really just being for a community, be it the Greek society as such, be it the Holocaust survivors in Greece or beyond Greece who have roots there, that I hope I achieved that.
Great note to end.
Thank you for being with us for exactly 1.5 hours. Our time is over. It was a wonderful journey. Thank you so much, Jeff, Daniel, Betsy, Gonda. I cannot wait to see you face to face soon in Prague at the Memory Studies Association conference in Prague. Gonda, unfortunately, won't be here with us, but I very much hope there will be another opportunity to catch up and exchange on all those topics. Have a wonderful afternoon, early evening, or midday if you are on another continent. And I very much hope to be continued and looking forward to see many of the memory studies scholars, members, activists soon in Prague and host you here in my hometown. Have a good day. Thank you very much.